The sun beat down, the water was a perfect, shimmering blue. My neighbor Karen, drink in hand, had made herself at home in my pool, again. I was about to tell her to leave when the gate clicked open. But it wasn't my husband. It was hers. And he wasn't there for a swim. The relentless Texas sun was a hammer, beating down on the manicured lawns of the cul-de-sac. But inside the cool turquoise water of David's pool, Karen felt nothing but a blissful, boozy haze. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses, the plastic frames hot against her temples, and took a long, slow sip of the margarita David had begrudged her. His tequila, his limes, his pool. The thought sent a little thrill of satisfaction through her. It was just so easy to get under his skin. She'd been coming over for the past 3 weeks, ever since her own pool pump had conveniently broken. Her husband, Tom, was supposed to fix it, but Tom was Tom. Good for paying the bills and not much else. He wouldn't notice if the house burned down around him, let alone a faulty piece of pool equipment. So Karen had simply started letting herself into David's backyard. He was a pushover, a quiet man who worked from home and seemed to shrink every time she appeared at his gate, a bright floral print towel slung over her shoulder. Just until Tom gets the part. "Ordered, sweetie," she'd chirped the first time, her voice dripping with a sweetness she knew he wouldn't challenge. He'd just nodded, his eyes darting away from her cleavage, which she'd made sure was prominently displayed in her new bikini. Today, however, was different. Today, there was a charge in the air, a static hum of tension that even the chilled margarita couldn't completely numb. David was standing by the glass patio door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw a hard, tight line. He hadn't said more than 2 words to her since she'd arrived an hour ago, and his silence was beginning to feel less like meekness and more like a coiled spring. "You know, David," Karen began, her voice loud in the quiet afternoon, little music would really liven this place up. It's like a morgue over here." She swirled the ice in her glass, the clinking sound unnaturally sharp. He didn't answer, just continued to stare out at the shimmering water, his gaze fixed on something beyond her. She followed his line of sight to the far end of the pool, where a small iridescent dragonfly was hovering, its wings a blur of motion. It was a stupid, insignificant thing, and his fascination with it was irritating. "Hello? Earth to David?" she called out, a sharp edge to her tone now. "Did you hear me? Music? You know, that thing with the rhythm and the beat?" He finally turned his head, his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, meeting hers. There was something in them she hadn't seen before, a flicker of something hard, something cold. "I heard you, Karen." His voice was flat, devoid of its usual hesitant politeness. It was the voice of a stranger, and it sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. She sat up a little straighter, her bare feet planting themselves firmly on the submerged top step of the pool. "Well?" she pressed, refusing to let him see her unease. "Are you going to put some on? Or are you just going to stand there like a garden gnome?" He took a step forward, away from the door, and the sunlight caught the silver in his hair. He looked older than his 45 years, she thought. Worn down. "Good, I think," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "That it's time for you to go home, Karen." The words hung in the hot, still air, as shocking as a splash of icy water. Karen's mouth fell open. She stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the awkward little laugh that always followed his attempts at assertiveness. But it didn't come. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, waiting. "Excuse me?" she finally managed, her voice a squeak of indignation. "What did you just say to me?" "I said," he repeated, taking another slow, deliberate step towards the edge of the pool, "it's time for you to go." A hot, furious blush crept up her neck. The audacity. After all she'd done for him, the casseroles she'd brought, over when his wife left him, The way she always made sure to invite him to the neighborhood block parties, even though he was such a wet blanket. This was the thanks she got? I don't think so, she said, her voice low and dangerous. She stood up, the water sluicing off her body, and placed her hands on her hips. My pool is broken, in case you've forgotten. Tom is working on it. I'm not going anywhere until it's fixed. It was a lie, of course. Tom was probably at the golf course or maybe taking a nap in his leather recliner. But David didn't need to know that. That's not my problem, he said, his voice still maddeningly level. This is my house, my pool, and I want you to leave. You can't be serious, she scoffed, a harsh, ugly laugh escaping her lips. You're kicking me out? After everything? What everything, Karen? He asked, a bitter little smile twisting his lips. The casseroles you brought over that were clearly leftovers from your own family's dinner? The party invitations you only extended because you felt guilty? You've done nothing for me. You've only ever taken. The truth of his words was a slap in the face, and she recoiled as if he'd physically struck her. She opened her mouth to retaliate, to unleash a torrent of insults that would cut him down to size. But before she could utter a single word, the sound of the side gate, clicking open, made them both freeze. They turned in unison, their petty squabble momentarily forgotten. A man was standing there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was holding a small, unassuming toolbox in one hand, and his eyes, dark and unblinking, were fixed on Karen. It was Tom, but it wasn't the Tom she knew. The usual slack-jawed indifference was gone, replaced by an intensity that was both foreign and terrifying. He looked at her, then at David, then back at her, his gaze lingering on the thin straps of her bikini, the way the wet fabric clung to her skin. Tom, she said, her voice a little breathless. She forced a bright, brittle smile. What are you doing here, sweetie? I thought you were at the club. He didn't answer. He just started walking towards them, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the flagstone patio. The toolbox swung gently by his side, a pendulum marking the seconds of an unbearable silence. David, for his part, seemed to have shrunk back into himself. He took a step back, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Tom, hey, he said, his voice a little shaky. We were just, I know what you were doing, Tom said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stopped at the edge of the pool, looming over them like a storm cloud. He looked at Karen, his eyes boring into hers. Get out of the pool. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And for the first time in their 15 years of marriage, Karen didn't even think to argue. She scrambled out of the water, her heart pounding against her ribs. She reached for her towel, but his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. Not you, he snarled, his gaze shifting to David. Him. David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Tom, I don't know what you think you saw, but I saw plenty, Tom interrupted, his voice laced with a cold, quiet fury that was far more frightening than any shouting match. I saw my wife, in your pool, in a bikini that leaves nothing to the imagination. I saw the way you were looking. At her. The way you're still looking at her. I wasn't looking at her, David protested, his voice rising in panic. I was telling her to leave, I swear. Tom's lips curled into a sneer. Oh, I bet you were. I bet you were just about to tell her to leave right before you invited her inside for a private swimming lesson. That's not what happened, Karen cried, finding her voice at last. David was being a jerk. He was kicking me out. Tom's grip on her wrist tightened, and she winced in pain. You stay out of this, he said, his eyes never leaving David's face. This is between me and him. He released her wrist and took a step towards David, who instinctively took a step back. I'm a patient man, David, Tom said, his voice deceptively soft. I've put up with a lot. The late-night phone calls, the accidental run-ins at the grocery store, the way you always seem to be watering your lawn whenever she's out getting the mail. I've seen it all, and I've let it slide because I thought you were harmless." He paused, letting the silence stretch out, thick and suffocating. "But I was wrong. You're not harmless. You're a snake who's been trying to slither his way into my garden." He took another step, and David stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of a lounge chair. He flailed his arms, trying to regain his balance, but it was too late. He fell, landing hard on the hot concrete with a cry of pain. Tom stood. Over him, a dark, menacing shadow. He looked down at David, his face a mask of cold, contemptuous rage. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to where he'd left the toolbox. He knelt down, unlatched it, and took out a heavy, industrial-sized wrench. Karen's blood ran cold. "Tom, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't. Please." He ignored her. He walked back to where David was struggling to sit, up, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He raised the wrench, the polished steel glinting in the sunlight. "This is for my wife," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl, and then he brought the wrench down. The sound was not what Karen expected. It wasn't a cinematic crack, but a sickening, wet thud, like a melon dropped from a great height onto pavement. A sound that vibrated through the soles of her bare feet and up into her teeth. A flock of sparrows, startled from the dense leaves of the oak tree overhead, exploded into the sky. For a heartbeat, the world was just that sound, the frantic beat of wings, and the single sharp gasp that escaped David's lips before he collapsed, boneless, onto the flagstones. A dark, crimson flower began to bloom on the side of David's head, spreading with horrifying speed into his silver hair. Karen's mind refused to process it. This wasn't real. It was a dream, a margarita-fueled nightmare. People like them, people who lived in houses with 3-car garages and paid someone to trim their hedges into perfect spheres, did not do things like this. Tom stood over the unmoving body, his chest heaving. The wrench hung loosely in his hand, a drop of blood clinging to its metal jaw before falling with a soft pat onto the concrete. He stared down at David, his face a blank canvas of shock, the rage of a moment ago already draining away, leaving something hollow and terrifying in its place. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a trance to find a bomb detonated in his hands. Karen's paralysis broke. A scream, thin and reedy, tore from her throat. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched as if she could somehow rewind time, pushed the wrench back up into the air, and put the blood back where it belonged. "Oh my God, Tom! What did you do?" Her voice seemed to snap him out of his stupor. His head jerked up, his eyes wide and wild, finding hers. He started, his voice a hoarse whisper. You saw him," David groaned, a low animal sound of pure agony. His hand twitched, his fingers curling into a weak fist. He was alive. The realization hit Karen with the force of a physical blow. He was alive, and they were standing here doing nothing. "We have to call 911, she shrieked, fumbling for the phone she'd left on the patio table next to her empty margarita glass. Her fingers were clumsy, slick with a mixture of pool water and cold sweat. "No!" Tom's voice was a whip crack. He lunged, not at David, but at her, grabbing the phone from her hand and hurling it across the yard. It hit the brick wall of the house with a sharp crack and fell, shattered into a bed of petunias. "Are you insane?" she screamed, backing away from him. This was not her husband. This was a monster wearing his face. "Shut up, Karen. Just shut up and think!" he hissed, advancing on her. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip bruising. "Nobody calls anyone. Nobody saw anything." "They'll hear," she sobbed, gesturing wildly at the neighboring houses, their windows like blank, unseeing eyes. "Someone must have heard." Heard what? A little argument? Tom's eyes darted around the yard, his mind working, calculating. The rage was gone, replaced by a chilling reptilian focus. He was a man who solved problems, and this was just the biggest problem he'd ever faced. He looked back down at David, who was now trying to push himself up, his movements slow and agonizing. A fresh wave of blood pulsed from the wound, staining the pristine patio a deeper shade of red. Tom's face hardened. "He can't identify us." Before Karen could process the horrifying implication of his words, he was moving. He strode back to David, raised the wrench again, his movements now brutally efficient, devoid of the rage that had fueled the first blow. "Tom, no!" Karen threw herself at him, clawing at his arm, trying to pull him back. It was like trying to move a statue. He shoved her away with a grunt of effort, sending her stumbling backward. She tripped over the leg of a lounge chair, the same one David had fallen over moments before, and landed hard on her back, the air knocked from her lungs. From the ground, she had a perfect, unobstructed view. She saw the wrench rise, a silver, arc against the impossibly blue sky. She saw it fall, another thud, this one heavier, more final. And then, silence. A profound, absolute silence, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower and the frantic, terrified hammering of her own heart. David didn't move again. Tom stood there for a long moment, the wrench dripping by his side. He took a deep, shuddering breath, then another. The transformation was complete. The panicked, shocked man was gone. In his place was someone cold, decisive, and utterly in control. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Get up." She couldn't move. Her limbs were leaden, her mind a screaming void. "Karen, get up!" His voice was low, each word a steel pellet. He walked over and hauled her to her feet as if she were a disobedient child. He pushed her towel into her hands. "Dry yourself off. We're leaving." "We can't just leave him here," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the still form on the patio. "Watch me," he said. He walked back to the toolbox, placed the bloody wrench inside with a calm, deliberate motion, and closed the lid. He picked it up, then grabbed her arm, his grip inescapable. He dragged her, stumbling and sobbing, towards the side gate. "My bag," she stammered, thinking of her purse, her keys, her life sitting on the patio table. "Forget it," he snapped. "We were never here." The short walk to their house next door felt like a journey across a desert. The sun was still hot, the air was still thick with the scent of cut grass and chlorine, but everything had changed. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was sliding off the edge. He pushed her through their front door into the cool, air-conditioned stillness of their home. Everything was perfect. The gleaming hardwood floors, the abstract art on the walls, the vase of fresh lilies on the console table. It was a museum of a life that no longer existed. He released her, and she sagged against the wall, her legs finally giving out. She slid to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, rocking back and forth, the sobs she'd been holding back finally erupting in ragged, tearing gasps. Tom watched her for a moment, his face impassive. "Stop it," he said, his voice flat. "Crying isn't going to help." He walked into the kitchen and came back with a glass of water, thrusting it at her. "Drink this, and listen to me. Listen very carefully." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and mascara. He crouched down in front of her, his eyes boring into hers. "We were home all afternoon," he said, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. "We were watching a movie. You felt a little sick, a headache. You took a nap. I was in my study working. Do you understand?" She shook her head, unable to form words. "Do you understand?" he repeated, his voice sharper. He gave her a little shake. She nodded numbly. "David had an accident," he continued. "He must have slipped and hit his head. A tragic accident. We'll be as shocked as everyone else when we hear the news." "They'll find out," she whispered. "They'll know." "How?" he countered, his confidence unnerving. "There are no witnesses. You threw your phone in the bushes. My toolbox is in the garage. We walked home. No one saw us. It's his word against... Well, it's not against anyone's word, is it?" A flicker of a grim smile touched his lips. The casual cruelty of it made her stomach churn. "Why, Tom?" she finally managed to ask, the question that had been screaming in her mind. "Why did you do it?" He stood up, towering over her again. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw not just anger, but a deep, festering resentment, an ocean of bitterness she'd never known was there. "Because I'm not an idiot, Karen," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I see things. I saw the way you looked at him. The way you'd get dressed up just to take out the trash if you knew he was outside. You think I didn't know your pool pump has been working fine for a week? You think I didn't know what you were doing over there, flaunting yourself in front of that pathetic loser?" He began to pace the hallway, his movements agitated, a predator in a cage of his own making. "You disrespected me, Karen, in my own neighborhood. You made me a fool. And him, he encouraged it. He let you. He wanted you. I saw it in his eyes. He got what he deserved. He was twisting it, reframing a brutal murder as some kind of righteous act, a defense of his honor. He was making it her fault. The injustice of it was a fresh wave of nausea. She had flirted, yes. She had enjoyed the attention, the petty thrill of making another man want her and making David uncomfortable. But this was a chasm, a universe away from a harmless flirtation. "So this is my fault?" she choked out, disbelief warring, with terror. "You set the pieces on the board," he said, stopping his pacing to look at her. "I just made the final move." He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. The picture of control. "Now this is what we're going to do. You are going to go upstairs, take a shower, and wash the smell of chlorine and him off of you. You are going to put on some clothes. And then you are going to come downstairs, and we are going to sit on the couch and be the grieving, shocked neighbors. That is our story. And you will stick to it. Because if you don't..." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "If you even think about saying anything else, I will tell them you were in on it, that you lured him out, that you held him down. It will be my word against the cheating wives. Who do you think they'll believe?" The threat hung in the air, a poisoned dart. He had thought of everything. He had trapped her, sealed every exit. Her life was over. Her perfect, manicured suburban life had been a lie, and now it was a cage. She stared at him, at this stranger she had been married to for 15 years, and saw him for what he truly was. Not a passive bill-paying machine, but a monster of Q. The 3 knocks were like hammer blows against the fragile shell of Tom's composure. For a split second, he just stared at the solid oak door, his carefully constructed alibi crumbling into dust before it could even be spoken. Karen watched. Him, a sliver of malicious satisfaction cutting through her terror. He didn't have a plan for this. The master manipulator, the cold, calculating problem solver, was caught flat-footed. Then the mask snapped back into place. He shot her a look of pure venom, a silent command to remember her lines in this sudden, terrifying play. He smoothed the front of his polo shirt, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. Karen scrambled to her feet, her heart a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She tried to arrange her face into something resembling normalcy, but it felt like trying to sculpt sand. Through the beveled glass panels flanking the door, she could see 2 figures, their shapes distorted and wavy, their dark uniforms a stark contrast to the bright, sunny afternoon. Tom opened the door. "Can I help you, officers?" His voice was a masterpiece of casual concern. He sounded like a man interrupted from a quiet afternoon of reading the paper, not a man who had just bludgeoned his neighbor to death. The 2 police officers were a study in contrasts. The one who spoke was older, with a weary, bloodhound face and a stomach that strained against the buttons of his uniform. His partner was younger, sharp-featured, and alert, his eyes constantly moving, taking in the pristine hallway, the expensive, Art, and Karen, who was trying to shrink into the wall behind Tom. "Are you Thomas Miller?" the older cop asked, his voice a gravelly monotone. "I am," Tom said, leaning against the doorframe, the picture of relaxed cooperation. "What's this all about?" "And is this Karen Miller?" the cop continued, his gaze shifting to Karen. She flinched as if he'd called her a slur. She could only manage a jerky nod. "We received a call a little while ago from your neighbor, David Allen," the officer said, his eyes flicking back to Tom. "A disturbance complaint. He said your wife was trespassing on his property, refusing to leave." The words landed in the silent hallway with the force of a physical blow. It was so much worse than she could have imagined. Not a witness, not a security camera. It was David himself, a voice from beyond the grave pointing a spectral finger directly at her. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees went weak. This was it. The lie was dead on arrival. They were caught. Tom, however, didn't even blink. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his face for a nanosecond before being replaced by a look of weary resignation. He sighed, a long put-upon sound, and ran a hand through his hair. "Oh, for God's sake," he said, shaking his head with the air of a man burdened by a difficult spouse. "I am so sorry you had to come all the way out here for that, officers. It's a complete misunderstanding." He turned to Karen, his eyes full of a manufactured disappointment that was chillingly convincing. "Karen, honey, what did I tell you? You can't just keep going over there. David's a private person. You have to respect his boundaries. He was brilliant. In one swift, audacious move, he had absorbed the truth of the complaint and twisted it into his narrative. He wasn't denying she was there. He was confirming it, but framing it as a minor, embarrassing neighborhood squabble. He was painting her as a nuisance, and himself as the responsible, long-suffering husband. The younger cop's eyes narrowed slightly. He took a step forward. "So, she was just over there? A little while ago?" "Yes," Tom said, his tone apologetic. "She's been... Well, our pool pump is on the fritz, and she's been a little stir-crazy. I've told her she needs to wait for an invitation, but she can be a bit persistent." He gave a small, indulgent smile. "I went over to get her myself not 20 minutes ago. Apologized to David for the intrusion. Everything's fine." It was a lie woven from a thread of truth, the most dangerous kind. He was building a new story on the fly, one that accounted for the police being there, one that placed both of them at the scene, but in an innocent context. "We'd still like to have a word with Mr. Allen," the older cop said, his expression unchanging. "Just to confirm that the situation is resolved." Of course," Tom said, stepping back and gesturing magnanimously towards David's house. "He's right next door. I'm sure he'll tell you the same thing." The two officers exchanged a look. It was the younger one who spoke again, his voice sharp and precise. "That might be difficult, sir, seeing as we found him less than 10 minutes ago, face down in his pool." The world tilted. Karen's breath hitched in her throat. In the pool? But he was on the patio. The blood. All that blood. Tom's composure finally, visibly fractured. His jaw went slack. "What? What are you talking about? He's in the pool? Is he okay?" The performance was flawless. The shock, the concern, it was all there. But Karen, standing behind him, could see the tiny muscle twitching in his jaw, the beads of sweat forming on his temples. "No, sir, he's not okay," the young cop said, his voice hardening. "He's dead." "Dead?" Tom's voice was a choked whisper. He staggered back a step, grabbing the doorframe for support. "My God! How? Did he drown?" "We're not sure of the cause of death at this time," the older cop said, his eyes fixed on Tom's face, watching, searching. "The paramedics are with him now. But the call we got wasn't from Mr. Allen. It was from the security company that monitors his home. A panic alarm was triggered from inside the house." Another piece of the puzzle Tom hadn't accounted for. A panic alarm. Triggered inside the house. "When we arrived, the back patio door was wide open," the younger cop added, his gaze shifting to Karen. "And there was a woman's purse on the patio table and a shattered cell phone in the flower bed. Would you happen to know anything about that, ma'am?" All eyes were on her. Tom's, boring into the back of her head with a silent, desperate command. The cops. Sharp and questioning. She felt like an insect pinned to a board. The purse, her phone, she had forgotten. In the panic of the moment, she had forgotten the pieces of her life she'd left behind. I... Her voice was a dry rustle of leaves. Her mind was a blank, white wall of panic. Tom's story, her story, the truth, it was all a tangled, screaming mess. "It's her purse," Tom cut in, his voice recovering its strength. He was fighting back, shoring up the defenses. "She must have left it when I went to get her. And the phone, she's always dropping that thing. It's probably been broken for days." "I see," the older cop said, his voice laced with skepticism. He took a step into the hallway, his presence filling the space. The smell of stale, coffee, and authority wafted off him. "Mr. Miller, I notice you have a scrape on your knuckles. And is that dirt on your trousers?" Tom looked down at his hand as if seeing it for the first time. A small, raw abrasion marred the skin over his right knuckle. He must have scraped it when he shoved her, when she'd fallen over the lounge chair. And his knees, faint smudges of dirt and grass, stained the khaki of his trousers from when he had knelt to get the wrench from the toolbox. Tiny details, insignificant, meaningless details that were suddenly screaming their guilt. "I was doing some gardening earlier," Tom said, his voice a little too quick, a little too loud. "Before our movie, pulled some weeds." "Gardening," the young cop repeated, his tone flat. He looked at Tom's immaculate manicured hands. "Doesn't look like you've been digging in the dirt, sir." The air in the hallway was thick, suffocating. Every lie was being met with a quiet, implacable question. Every explanation only seemed to dig the hole deeper. The older cop's radio crackled to life, a burst of static followed by a tinny, disembodied voice. He lifted it to his ear, listening intently. Karen watched his face, saw his eyes widen almost imperceptibly. He grunted a response and clipped the radio back to his belt. He looked at his partner, then at Tom. His weary, bloodhound expression had been replaced by something else. Something hard and certain. "Well, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Looks like your gardening story might have a problem." He paused, letting the silence stretch, a string being pulled tighter and tighter until it was ready to snap. "My forensics team just found something next to the body. It appears Mr. Allen wasn't alone when he died. They found a toolbox." He locked his eyes on Tom's. "And it's got your name engraved on the handle." The word toolbox detonated in the silent hallway. It was the kill shot, the irrefutable physical proof that shattered Tom's frantic tapestry of lies. Karen saw the blood drain from his face, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. The confident, manipulative man who had held her life in his hands just moments before seemed to shrink inside his expensive polo shirt, his arrogance collapsing like a building imploding on itself. He opened his mouth, but for the first time, no words came out, just a dry, clicking sound in the back of his throat. He looked from the impassive face of the older cop to the sharp, accusatory gaze of the younger one. He was a chess master who had just had his king swept from the board. My toolbox?" He finally stammered, the words thick and clumsy. "That's impossible. It's in the garage. I must have left it over there earlier, weeks ago. I was helping David with a leaky faucet." It was a pathetic, desperate lunge, and everyone in the hallway knew it. The younger cop almost smiled. A leaky faucet? Funny, the toolbox we found wasn't in the house. It was on the patio right next to the pool, and it wasn't full of plumbing supplies. It was open, with a single heavy-duty wrench sitting inside, a wrench that appears to have blood and hair on it. Every word was a nail in the coffin. Tom stared, his mind visibly scrambling for an escape route where there was none. He looked at Karen, his eyes pleading, commanding, threatening all at once. Stick to the story. Don't you dare break. But the story was a sinking ship, and he was trying to chain her to the anchor. The threat he'd made, "It will be my word," against the cheating wives, felt like a hollow echo from a different lifetime. Looking at him now, stripped of his power, his lies exposed, she didn't see a monster to be feared. She saw a pathetic, cornered animal. The older cop took a slow step forward. "Thomas Miller, you're under arrest for the murder of David Allen. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the officer recited the Miranda rights, his younger partner stepped forward and, with a swift, practiced movement, pulled Tom's hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place was the loudest sound Karen had ever heard. It was the sound of her old life ending. Tom didn't resist. He seemed to have gone somewhere else, his body rigid with shock. Neighbors were starting to gather on their lawns, drawn by the sight of the police cars. Karen saw Mrs. Henderson from across the street, her hand over her mouth. The carefully maintained facade of their perfect suburban life was being ripped away in front of an audience. "Ma'am," the older cop said, his voice softening slightly as he turned to Karen, "we're going to need you to come down to the station to give a statement." It wasn't a request. She nodded numbly, her gaze fixed on her husband as he was led, stumbling, out of their pristine hallway and into the unforgiving sunlight. The man who had controlled her, belittled her, and ultimately destroyed her was being paraded in front of their neighbors in handcuffs. There was no triumph in it, only a vast, empty sickness. The police station was a world away from her cul-de-sac. It was a place of harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant, and a low, constant hum of human misery. They put her in a small, windowless room with a metal table and 2 chairs. It was cold. She was still in her damp sundress, a floral print towel draped over her shoulders like a shroud. A female officer had given her a thin, scratchy blanket. She sat for what felt like hours, the events of the afternoon replaying in her mind in a dizzying, nauseating loop. David's cold anger, the sickening thud of the wrench, the blood blooming on the flagstones, Tom's reptilian focus, his chilling threats. Finally, the door opened and the older detective, Detective Miller, she'd learned his name was, came in. He sat down opposite her, placing a thin file folder on the table between them. He looked tired, his bloodhound face etched with deep lines. "Karen," he began, his voice gentle, "I know this has been a traumatic experience for you, but I need you to tell me exactly what happened this afternoon. From the beginning, this was it, her moment of choice." Tom's threats still echoed in her ears, but the reality of the cold, sterile interrogation room was more powerful. She was a witness to a murder, and the murderer was trying to make her an accomplice, a lifetime of deferring to Tom, of letting his will be her own, fought against the primal instinct for self-preservation. But looking at the detective's weary, patient eyes, she knew she couldn't live the lie. She couldn't protect him. She wouldn't. "He killed him," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Tom killed him." The detective just nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Tell me everything," And so she did. The words came out in a torrent, a chaotic, sobbing confession of her own foolishness and Tom's monstrous rage. She told him about the fake broken pool, Pump, her relentless teasing of David, the argument, Tom's sudden appearance. She described the first blow, David's groan, her desperate attempt to call for help, and the final brutal attack. She left nothing out. It was ugly and shameful, but it was the truth. When she was finished, she felt hollowed out, exhausted. The detective had listened without interruption, his pen scratching across a notepad. "Thank you, Karen," he said quietly. "That took courage." He closed his notepad and leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Your husband's story is a little different. He's claiming it was an accident. That he went over there to confront David, they argued. David slipped and hit his head on the edge of the pool." "That's a lie," she cried, a fresh wave of indignation rising in her. "There was so much blood. He hit him with the wrench. I saw it." "We know," the detective said calmly. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death was blunt force trauma. The story about slipping and falling doesn't hold water. He paused, his gaze intensifying. "But there's one part of your story, Karen, that doesn't quite line up with the evidence." A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. "What? I told you everything." "You said Tom killed him on the patio," the detective said, his eyes searching hers. "You described the blood on the flagstones?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. It was awful. The thing is," the detective continued, leaning back in his chair, "we didn't find the body on the patio. We found him in the shallow end of the pool, face down. And our forensics team just came back with their preliminary findings. The patio has been washed down, hosed off. There are trace amounts of blood in the grout between the stones, but the large pool of blood you described is gone." Karen stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the implications. Washed down? But when? How? They had left immediately. Tom had dragged her away from the scene. I don't understand," she stammered. "We left. We went straight. Home. Tom was with me the whole time." The detective's eyes held hers, and in their weary depths, she saw not accusation, but a dawning, horrifying understanding. He opened the file folder on the table. He slid a single glossy photograph across the metal surface towards her. "We found this in David's home office, right next to the panic button," he said, his voice low and grave. "It was on his computer screen, pulled up from a live feed. It seems David had a new security system installed last week. High-definition cameras covering every inch of his backyard." Karen looked down at the photograph. It was a still image, crystal clear, taken from a high angle. It showed the pool, the patio, the lounge chairs. It showed David's body lying on the flagstones, a dark halo of blood around his head, and it showed a figure kneeling beside the body, a garden hose in their hand, calmly, methodically washing her husband's crime away. The figure was her. Karen's world dissolved into the glossy 8x10 photograph. It was her. Unmistakably her. The floral sundress, the blonde hair plastered to her skull, the bare feet. But the woman in the picture was a stranger, a hollow-eyed automaton performing, a gruesome task with a chilling lack of emotion. Her own hands, her own body, were moving in a way her mind refused to recognize. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, a frantic, jerky motion. "That's not me. It's fake. You faked this." The accusation was flimsy, pathetic, but it was the only shield her shattered mind could find. Detective Miller didn't argue. He simply reached into the file again and pulled out a small tablet. He tapped the screen and turned it to face her. "The camera records video, Karen. Time-stamped." He pressed play. The scene was the same as the photograph, but it was alive. She saw Tom, his face a mask of cold fury, deliver the final brutal blow. She saw herself, a crumpled heap on the ground. She saw him haul her to her feet. And then, the script of her memory diverged from the horrifying reality on the screen. He didn't drag her away. He shoved her towards the coiled garden hose on the side of the house. His voice was inaudible on the silent video, but his gestures were sharp, commanding. He pointed at the blood, then at the hose, then at her. He was giving orders. And the woman on the screen, the stranger wearing her skin, obeyed. She picked up the hose, her movements stiff and robotic, and turned on the water. As the first spray hit the blood-soaked flagstones, Tom turned and walked calmly out of the frame through the side gate. He was leaving. He was leaving her there. The video played on in agonizing silence. She watched herself meticulously wash the patio, guiding the crimson water towards the pool's edge, where it bled into the turquoise blue, turning it a murky, sickening brown. She was a ghost, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a man, who was already next door building his alibi. I don't remember this, she choked out, the words catching in her throat. The cold of the interrogation room had seeped into her bones, a deep, internal chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He took me home. We were together. He came back for you, the detective said, his voice flat. The timestamp shows you were in that yard alone for 7 minutes. Then he re-enters the frame, grabs your arm, and pulls you away. 2 minutes after that, the first 911 call comes in from the security company. 7 minutes, a black hole in her memory that contained the most incriminating act of her life. The shock, the trauma. Her mind had simply cut it out, a self-preservation mechanism that had now become her damnation. Tom hadn't just made her a witness, he had made her a participant. He had used her as his cleanup crew, knowing that if the worst came to pass, the evidence would point not just to him but to her as well. His threat wasn't a hypothetical, it was a blueprint he had already put into action. But the body, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the tablet. You said he was in the pool. Watch, the detective said. He fast-forwarded the footage. The patio was now clean, eerily pristine. The sun beat down on an empty scene. Then a flicker of movement from the sliding glass door. A figure, dark with blood, crawled slowly, painfully, out of the house. It was David. A strangled sob escaped Karen's lips. He was alive. After everything, he was still alive. He dragged himself across the clean patio, leaving a fresh, gruesome trail of blood in his wake. He was heading for the gate, for help. But he was too weak. He collapsed at the edge of the pool, his body convulsing before rolling with a soft splash into the shallow end. He lay there, face down, and was still, the panic alarm. He had made it inside. He had hit the button. He had called for help with his last ounce of strength. The full, monstrous scope of Tom's depravity crashed down on her. He hadn't just killed a man in a fit of rage. It was a cold, calculated execution followed by a masterful, immediate cover-up designed to implicate her. He had counted on her being too terrified, too broken, to defy him. He had used her own trauma as a weapon against her. A new feeling began to smolder in the hollowed-out pit of her stomach, burning through the shock and the fear. It was rage. A pure, white-hot rage for the man she had married, for the years she had wasted, for the life he had so casually destroyed. Not just David's, but hers. He had tried to make her his accomplice, his scapegoat, the cheating wife, the hysterical woman who would be an unreliable witness. He will not get away with this, she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a low, dangerous growl that she didn't recognize as her own. She looked up from the tablet, her eyes meeting the detective's. The tears were gone, replaced by a hard, brittle clarity. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. I'll show them that video, and I will narrate every single second. 6 Months later, Karen sat in the witness box, the polished wood cool beneath her trembling hands. The courtroom was packed, a silent, expectant sea of faces. Across the room, Tom sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. He had aged a decade. He wouldn't look at her. The prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ada Ramirez, stood before a large screen. "Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room, "I know this is difficult, but I'm going to play the security footage from David Allen's backyard. Can you please tell the court what is happening?" The video began to play. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Karen watched the silent, grainy figures move across the screen. She saw her own foolishness, her petty cruelty towards David. She saw Tom's arrival, a storm cloud of jealousy and rage. When the moment of the attack came, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. Karen didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the screen, on the image of her husband, the man she had once loved, turning into a monster. "He's hitting him with the wrench," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He hit him twice." Ramirez paused the video. "And what happened next, Mrs. Miller?" "He came to me," Karen said, her gaze finally shifting, locking onto Tom. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. "He told me I had to clean it up. He said if I didn't, we would both go to prison, and he would make sure I took all the blame." The video played on, showing the horrifying 7 minutes she couldn't remember but could now see. She described her own actions as if narrating. A nature documentary, her voice detached, clinical. She was no longer the woman on that screen. She was the survivor, the witness. Finally, they showed the last heartbreaking moments of David's life, his agonizing crawl across the patio, his final desperate act of hitting the panic alarm, when the lights came up. There wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Tom's defense was in shambles. His story of a tragic accident had been obliterated by the high-definition reality of the video. His attempt to paint Karen as an unhinged, complicit partner had backfired spectacularly. The jury saw not an accomplice, but a victim, another casualty of his explosive, possessive rage. The verdict came back in under an hour. Guilty on all counts. As they led Tom away in handcuffs for the second and final time, he finally looked at her. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the look of a king checkmated by a pawn he had long since dismissed. Karen met his gaze without flinching. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of him. He had taken everything from her, her home, her reputation, her sense of self. But in the wreckage, she had found something she never knew she possessed, a core of steel. She walked out of the courthouse alone, into the blinding Texas sun. The reporters swarmed, shouting questions, but she ignored them. She kept walking, her head held high. She didn't know where she was going or what her life would become, but she knew one thing for certain. The woman who had let herself into her neighbor's pool for a free margarita was gone forever. In her place was someone else, someone forged in blood and betrayal. Someone who had looked into the abyss and had, against all odds, found her way back.